She was 17 years old. On a freezing February night in 1974, she was sitting in a car in a Fort Worth parking lot, still wearing the dress from a Valentine's dance, her boyfriend in the seat beside her. It was late. The lot was almost empty, and neither of them noticed the man walking toward the car in the dark. He opened the passenger door. Before her boyfriend could understand what was happening, the man struck him across the head with a pistol, hard enough to knock him out cold. And in those few seconds, Carla Walker was gone. She would be alive for almost 2 more days. When her body was found in a culvert south of the city, Fort Worth promised her family they would find who did this. And on paper, they had everything: a crime scene, evidence sealed in an envelope, even a man questioned in the first weeks. Someone who lived less than a mile from her home. They brought him in. They asked about a gun. He said it was stolen. He passed a lie detector test, and they let him go. He was suspect number 22, and then he was nobody at all. Before we get into it, tell us in the comments where you're watching from, and if stories like this matter to you, subscribe. This is exactly the kind of case we tell here. And then nothing happened. Not for 1 year. Not for 10. Carla's mother died without knowing who killed her daughter. Her father died without knowing. The boy in the car carried a city's suspicion for the next 4.5 decades. For 46 years, the only thing standing between Carla Walker and the truth was a single, fragile piece of cloth, and a science that did not exist on the night she disappeared. This is the story of how that cloth finally spoke. How a case everyone had given up on became one of the most important cold cases in American history, and how the answer had been sitting on a list the whole time, at number 22. To understand what was taken, you have to start before the parking lot. You have to start with who Carla Walker actually was. In the winter of 1974, Fort Worth, Texas was a city of working families, church on Sunday, and Friday night football. It was the kind of place where neighbors knew each other's cars, where children rode bikes until the streetlights came on, and where most people still believed that nothing truly terrible could reach them on their own quiet street. Carla Walker was 17 years old. She was a junior, bright, popular, the kind of girl teachers remembered and classmates gravitated toward. She had a boyfriend named Rodney McCoy, a high school sweetheart, the relationship that feels, at 17, like the center of the entire world, and she had a family that adored her. Her younger brother Jim was 12 that winter. He worshipped his big sister the way a 12-year-old does, a little in her shadow, a little in awe of her. He was old enough to understand everything that was about to happen, and far too young to carry it. He would carry it anyway, for the next 46 years of his life. Years later, Jim would describe it simply. A wonderful life, he said, taken from them when Carla was just 17. He would talk about the silent anger he lived with, the rage of not knowing, the way an unanswered question can sit inside a person for decades and slowly become part of who they are. But in February of 1974, none of that had happened yet. In February of 1974, Carla Walker was a 17-year-old girl getting ready for a Valentine's dance, with her whole life still ahead of her. That is the version of her we should hold on to, because she deserves to be more than the way her story ends. The dance was held on the night of February 16, 1974. Carla went with Rodney, the way couples do on a night that's supposed to be about love. There were friends, music, the ordinary magic of being young on a Saturday night. When it ended, they didn't want it to be over yet, so they did what teenagers have always done. They drove to a quiet spot to sit and talk. The spot was the parking lot of a bowling alley on the west side of Fort Worth. It was late, well past midnight, edging into the early hours of February 17th. The lot was mostly empty. Rodney parked the car. For a little while, it was just the two of them, a 17-year-old girl and her boyfriend, sitting in a car in the cold, with no idea that someone was watching. Then the passenger door opened. A man was standing there. He had a pistol. Before Rodney could understand what was happening, the man struck him. Pistol whipped him across the head, hard enough to knock him unconscious. In those few seconds, in the front seat of that car, everything that mattered to two families was decided. When Rodney came to, the passenger seat was empty. Carla was gone. The man was gone. He would carry the memory of her final moments in that car for the rest of his life. Rodney did the only thing he could do. Bleeding, dazed, terrified, he got to the Walker home and raised the alarm. He told them what every word of it cost him to say, that someone had taken her, that he couldn't stop it. In an instant, the Walker household went from sleeping to shattered. A father pulled from bed into the worst night of his life. A 12-year-old brother, hearing it all, understanding just enough. And somewhere out in the dark of Tarrant County, a car with Carla Walker inside it, driving away from everyone who loved her. The clock had already started. What no one knew that night, what they would only learn later, in the cruelest possible way, was that Carla was still alive, and she would stay alive, in the hands of the man who took her, for nearly 2 more days. The search began immediately. Police, family, neighbors, volunteers. Fort Worth mobilized around a missing 17-year-old girl. They combed roadsides and fields and the empty stretches outside the city. Every hour that passed made the silence heavier. Everyone understood, even if no one said it out loud, what the odds were after the first night. 3 days after she was taken, on February 20th, 1974, the search ended the way these searches so often do. Carla's body was found in a culvert, a concrete drainage channel, out near Lake Benbrook, roughly half an hour south of Fort Worth, a place chosen for one reason, because the person who left her there believed she would never be found. What the autopsy revealed turned grief into something closer to horror. Carla had not been killed quickly. The examination indicated she had been kept alive for roughly 2 days after the abduction. In that time, she had been beaten, she had been tortured, she had been raped, and finally, she had been strangled. Toxicology showed morphine in her system, a detail that spoke to just how calculated the cruelty had been. This was not a crime of sudden panic. This was someone who took a child, kept her, and did unspeakable things to her over 2 days before discarding her body in a ditch. For her family, the discovery was the beginning of a different kind of nightmare. The not knowing of those 3 days was replaced by a knowing that would never let them rest. And for the Fort Worth Police Department, a search for a missing girl became a hunt for a killer. A hunt that, by every reasonable expectation, should have ended in an arrest within weeks. It didn't. To understand why, you have to look at what investigators had in their hands in 1974 and what they were missing. In the days after Carla's body was found, the Fort Worth Police Department did the work. They worked the scene. They worked the timeline. They built a list of suspects, men who fit, men with histories, men who'd been near the wrong place at the wrong time. And crucially, they recovered physical evidence. At the parking lot, a handgun magazine had been left behind, apparently dropped during the abduction. From Carla's body and her clothing, investigators collected and preserved biological samples. In 1974, they could not have told you what those samples would one day be worth. There was no national DNA database. There was no such thing as genetic profiling in a criminal case. DNA, as a tool for catching a killer, simply did not exist yet. But someone made a decision that would matter more than anyone could have known. They preserved the evidence. They kept the dress, they kept the samples, they sealed them away. Not because they had a plan for them, but because that is what you do. You keep the evidence for a future you cannot yet imagine. There was something else in that early investigation, a letter. Someone wrote to the police claiming to know something about the killing. It was strange, cryptic, the kind of message that could be a real lead or a cruel game. Investigators held on to it. Decades later, they would make it public, hoping fresh eyes might finally decode it. And then there was the man with the gun. During the original investigation, police looked at a Fort Worth resident who had purchased a .22 caliber Ruger, a pistol that used the very same type of magazine as the one dropped in that parking lot. On paper, it was the kind of detail that makes a detective sit up. They questioned him. He had an answer ready. The gun, he said, had been stolen from his truck. He agreed to take a polygraph. He passed it, and with that, he was eliminated, crossed off, moved to the bottom of a list of more than 20 names and effectively forgotten. His name was Glenn McCurley. He lived less than a mile from the Walker family. and it would take 46 years and a science that hadn't been invented yet to bring the investigation back to his door. For now, the leads dried up. The suspects didn't pan out. The letter led nowhere. The evidence sat in storage, decades ahead of the technology that could read it. And slowly, the most painful word in any family's vocabulary settled over the case: cold. There is a particular cruelty to a cold case that true crime sometimes glosses over. It isn't just that the killer goes free. It's what those years do to everyone left behind. For the Walker family, the decades did not bring peace. They brought erosion. Carla's parents grew old carrying a question that no one would answer. They wanted one thing before they died: to know who killed their daughter. Neither of them got it. Jim Walker would later speak about having to bury his father and then his mother, with the case still open, still silent, still cold. The people who loved Carla most ran out of time before the truth arrived. And then there was Rodney McCoy, the boy in the car. Think about his position. He was the last person known to be with Carla. He was the one who survived. In a case with no arrest, suspicion has to go somewhere, and for decades a portion of it clung to him. He lived under a shadow he had done nothing to earn. 46 years is a long time to live as a question mark. He wasn't the only one. Over the years, other names drifted into the orbit of the case. One man had lived near the Walkers in his youth. Decades later, as amateur investigators picked over the case online, he found himself named, targeted, harassed by strangers who were certain they'd solved it. He hadn't done anything, but that is what an unsolved case does. It spreads its damage outward, onto the innocent, onto anyone standing too close to the empty space where an answer should be. The case became something larger than itself in Fort Worth. It became a symbol, the girl from 1974 whose killer was never caught. Anniversary articles came and went. The file grew older. The evidence stayed in storage. But Jim Walker never let it go. Through all of it, the grief, the silent rage, the burials, the decades, he kept pushing. He kept asking. He kept believing that somewhere, in that sealed envelope of 1974 evidence, his sister's killer had left his name. He just needed someone who could finally read it. That someone was coming. But first, the world needed to change. To understand how Carla Walker's case was finally solved, you have to understand a revolution in forensic science, one that almost no one outside law enforcement saw coming. For decades, the gold standard for DNA in criminal cases was a system called CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, run by the FBI. The idea is simple. When someone is arrested or convicted for certain crimes, their DNA profile gets entered into CODIS. When investigators recover DNA from a crime scene, they run it against that database, looking for a direct match. If your killer is in the system, you find him. But there's a catch, and it's an enormous one. CODIS only contains the DNA of people who have already been caught. If your killer has never been arrested for anything that required a DNA sample, he simply isn't in there. You can have his complete genetic profile from the crime scene, run it 1,000 times, and get nothing, because the system has no one to compare it to. For someone who was never caught for anything else, CODIS is a locked door with no key. That was the wall Carla Walker's case ran into. The killer's DNA had been preserved, but there was no match, because the man who left it had never been in the system. Then, in 2018, everything changed. That year, investigators in California announced the arrest of the Golden State Killer, a man responsible for a long campaign of rapes and murders in the 1970s and 80s, who had eluded capture for decades. They caught him not with CODIS, but with something new: forensic genetic genealogy. Here's how it works. Instead of searching for the killer directly, you search for his family. Investigators take the crime scene DNA and build a different kind of profile, one based on hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, the same kind of data consumer ancestry companies use. Then they upload that profile to public genealogy databases, where ordinary people have voluntarily submitted their own DNA to find relatives and trace their family trees. The search doesn't look for an exact match. It looks for partial matches, a second cousin here, a third cousin there. From those distant relatives, genealogists work backwards and forwards, building out a family tree, narrowing branch by branch, generation by generation, until the tree points to one person who fits every detail. The right age, the right place, the right time. The technique never searches for the killer. It searches for his bloodline, and then follows the blood home. The Golden State Killer case proved it could be done, and it set off a wave. Across the country, cold case detectives began looking at their oldest, most hopeless files in an entirely new light. At the center of this new world was a company in Texas called Othram, built for one purpose: to pull usable genetic profiles out of the worst, most degraded DNA evidence, the tiny samples, the decades-old stains, the material every other lab had given up on. Which brings us back to Fort Worth, and to the last fragile piece of Carla Walker that survived. The renewed push on Carla's case came from people who refused to let it die: Fort Worth cold case detectives, and a name anyone who follows cold cases will recognize: Paul Holes, the investigator deeply associated with the genetic genealogy revolution, who featured Carla's case on a television series about using DNA to solve cold murders. It was Holes who helped connect the Fort Worth investigators to Othram, and that connection set the final chain of events in motion. But it almost ended before it began. There was a first attempt at a lab, and it went catastrophically wrong. The biological evidence from 1974 was precious and limited. There was only so much of it left after 46 years. The first laboratory consumed the entire sample it was given and came back with nothing usable. No profile, no leads, just gone. Sit with what that meant. After nearly half a century, the single best piece of evidence in the case, the killer's own DNA, was partially destroyed in the attempt to read it. For the people who had carried this case, it was a gut punch. The thing they'd waited decades to use was slipping through their fingers. But there was one more piece. Investigators went back to Carla's preserved clothing and recovered another sample, the last viable genetic material the case had. This time, they sent it to Othram, the lab built precisely for samples like this: small, degraded, and impossibly important. Then came the wait. Othram went to work building a genetic profile from that final sample and feeding it into the genealogical search. About 5 weeks later, the phone rang. On the other end was the lab, with a sentence the detective would never forget. They told him, essentially, "We have a last name for you. It's McCurley." The family tree had done its work. The matches had started distant, a second or third cousin, family lines that traced back to Denton County, and from those branches, the genealogists had narrowed the tree down, name by name, until it pointed at one man. And here is the detail that makes this case sting. Glenn McCurley was not a stranger. He was not some unknown drifter from another state. He was a Fort Worth man who had lived less than a mile from the Walkers. He was the man with the .22 caliber Ruger. He was the man who had been questioned in 1974, who said his gun was stolen, who passed a polygraph and was crossed off the list. He had been suspect number 22. The answer the family had waited 46 years for had been in the file the entire time, buried under a polygraph result and 21 other names. It took a science that didn't exist in 1974 to circle back and put a pen through every other name until only his was Lee name from a family tree is not the same as a conviction. Genetic genealogy gives investigators a direction. It points at a person, but then the old-fashioned detective work has to confirm it. You still have to prove that this specific man's DNA matches the evidence. So investigators did what detectives have done for generations. They watched and they waited. They put McCurley under surveillance, and they collected what he discarded, recovering DNA from the trash outside his home. That sample was tested against the crime scene profile. It matched. To lock it down, they approached McCurley directly and obtained a consensual cheek swab. That too matched. There was no longer any doubt. The DNA on the last surviving piece of Carla Walker's clothing belonged to Glenn Samuel McCurley. He was 77 years old. He had lived a long life in Fort Worth, a life Carla never got to have. For 46 years, he had been a free man, less than a mile from the family whose daughter he had taken. The arrest came, and when investigators searched his home, they found something that closed the loop on the very first thread of the 1974 investigation: the .22 caliber Ruger. The same gun he had told police, decades earlier, had been stolen from his truck. It had not been stolen. It had been in his possession the entire time, concealed in his home. A piece of the puzzle he had lied about in 1974 and kept for nearly half a century. The man who had been suspect number 22 was now under arrest for the murder of Carla Walker. All that remained was to prove it in a court of law, and in doing so, to make history. Glenn McCurley went on trial in August of 2021. This trial was not like other trials, and not only because of the decades it had taken to get there. It was a landmark. Genetic genealogy had cracked other famous cases, including the Golden State Killer, but those had ended in plea deals. They had never been fully tested in front of a jury. Carla Walker's case was poised to be the first in which forensic genetic genealogy was presented and defended in open court. Before the science could be shown to a jury, it had to survive a legal gatekeeping process, a hearing in which a judge evaluates whether a scientific method is reliable enough to be admitted as evidence. The genealogy passed that test. The door opened, and for the first time, a jury was going to hear how a killer had been identified through the DNA of his own distant relatives. The prosecution laid out the evidence, the DNA, the match, and that .22 caliber Ruger, the gun McCurley had claimed was stolen in 1974, recovered, concealed, from his own home. It never reached a verdict from the jury. On the third day of his trial, Glenn McCurley changed his plea to guilty. He was convicted of Carla Walker's murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For years afterward, he gave no real explanation. When a journalist later asked him why he had pleaded guilty, his answer was chillingly hollow. He said, in effect, that he'd simply had enough of being hounded. Not remorse, not confession in any meaningful sense, just exhaustion. Glenn McCurley died in prison in July of 2023. He was 80 years old. He died behind bars, which is more than the Walker family once dared to hope for, but he died without ever truly answering for the 2 days of cruelty he inflicted on a 17-year-old girl in 1974. The end of the case did not undo the damage of the decades, but it did something. Rodney McCoy, the boy in the car, who had carried a city's suspicion for 46 years, was cleared, completely. The shadow that had followed him since he was a teenager was finally lifted. He got his name back. Jim Walker, who had buried both his parents without an answer, finally had one. The wonderful life taken at 17 had, at long last, a measure of justice attached to it, and Carla's case became something bigger than one family's grief. Because it was the first genetic genealogy case to be defended in front of a jury, it helped establish the legal foundation for the technique, making it stronger, more accepted, more usable in courtrooms across the country. Every future case that relies on this science stands a little more firmly because of Carla Walker's. Her name was even attached to legislation. Lawmakers introduced the Carla Walker Act, a bill designed to fund this kind of advanced DNA testing and genetic genealogy work for agencies that can't otherwise afford it, so that other families, in other towns, with other cold cases, might one day get the call that the Walkers waited 46 years to receive. Because that is the real legacy here. Carla's case didn't just catch one man. It helped prove a method that has since brought answers to families who had given up hope entirely. Cases 30, 40, 50 years cold, suddenly solvable because of a fragile piece of cloth in Fort Worth that finally found a science capable of reading it. If there's one thing to take from Carla Walker's story, it's this: evidence outlives us. The detectives who sealed those samples in 1974 had no idea what they were preserving. They couldn't have. The technology was decades away, but they kept it anyway. And that single act of discipline is the only reason this case was ever solved. A killer can pass a polygraph. He can lie about a stolen gun. He can sit at number 22 on a list and walk free for 46 years. But he cannot unleave his DNA, and he cannot erase himself from the bloodline he shares with everyone he's related to. In the end, Glenn McCurley wasn't caught by a witness, or a confession, or a mistake he made in 1974. He was caught by his own family tree. There are thousands of cases still sitting in storage rooms across the country, waiting for the same thing Carla's case waited for: The right sample, the right lab, the right moment when the science finally catches up to the crime. One by one, they're being solved. Carla Walker was 17 years old. She was loved, and she had a whole life in front of her. It took 46 years, but her city kept its promise. They found him. If this story stayed with you, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you believe these cases deserve to be remembered, subscribe so the next one finds you too.